Well, thanks everyone today for joining us. We're about to kick off the Fireside chat on keeping banking open. I have joining us today James Brown from Fintech New Zealand and Jody Bullen from ANZ. And we're here really today to talk about everything to do with what's happening on the horizon with open banking or CDR, but also talk about innovation in New Zealand when it comes to financial services. And one thing that's lingering and we'll certainly be discussing in this conversation is around what's happening that's going to help the marketplace and that's going to help the participants and the providers as well as consumers. Just to quickly quote from the ministry consultation on open banking or CDR, their perspective is that it could give individuals and businesses access to a wide range of products and services to reduce search and switch costs, facilitate competition, and encourage innovation, and increase productivity to help build the digital economy. And I think that that's kind of similar to how a lot of other systems and governments have looked at this opportunity in how data is used by institutions and also to benefit consumers. There were four main options put on the table for discussions, and I know that discussions are still open at the moment. The first option was to do nothing, let everything sort of sit how it was. The next option was to look at a legislative framework, which would be pursued sector by sector, but not necessarily all. Another one was a economy-wide data sharing system. And then there was also going to be a fourth option, which was different rules for different sectors. And I think what we're seeing in Australia and also in the UK is a mixture of number 4 and number 2. And so we're here to discuss what could potentially happen in New Zealand. But starting off with you, James, from Fintech New Zealand, you've obviously seen this play out over the last, 12 to 18 months. You're probably quite up to date with discussions. Where are things at from your perspective, James?
Yeah, great opening question, and thanks everybody for joining us today. Look, I mean, the simple fact is that we've heard it from a number of returning Kiwis that although we are a quite small but agile economy, sometimes, unfortunately, we don't move quite as fast as we possibly should. So we, for about the last 12 to 18 months, have been in deep discussion with the government around what was back then open banking that evolved to open finance, and there's deep discussions in there around open data. So we are about to embark on an independent piece of work supported by government, MB, Minister Clark and the Digital Council to what actually could it look like really for New Zealand. We are conscious that when you consider other jurisdictions around the world, and even when you're actually considering free trade agreements, about making sure that the regulatory landscape here in New Zealand is such that it actually helps thrive or innovation to thrive rather than the opposite. So we are we're laying the foundations, you might be able to say, but it's definitely been a hard journey, or a harder journey than it really needs to be. And I think when your opening statement there about a mixture of number 4 and number 2, we definitely don't want to see it just being completely regulated, like i.e. the government just making the decision and drawing the line in the sand. To some extent, what we actually saw take place in the UK many, many years ago. Whereas if you look at what's happened in Australia, and obviously their adoption of CDR, customer data rights, that I think was a little bit more of a collaborative approach. And what we're trying to do is look at what is New Zealand's opportunity. And we have to take into consideration that we're a smaller marketplace. We could move more quickly. But equally, what is the impact? What is the unintended consequences to our Marion Pacific, to what some people might say the unbanked, to our SME marketplace, because generally that's the big part of our economy. What does it mean for our aging wealthy? So there's lots of things that have to be factored in. And some people might argue we're not moving quickly enough, but the reality is, I think Jody would probably agree, it's fairly complicated. It's not really as simple as just making a decision. and rolling these things out. And also, actually, what does it mean for the person on the high street? If you walk into any New Zealand town centre and ask someone about open banking or open finance or open data, you might get a variety of answers. And I don't know, Jody, what your views are, but certainly from our point of view, that we see this as a positive. We think it will create more competition in the market. We think it will create more transparency in the market. We'll definitely see more new products and solutions into the market. And all of that, as long as we're taking the majority or as many people as we possibly can on the journey, it will be good for every Kiwi. So that's my view, that we're a little bit behind the 8 ball. We're moving forward. We will get there. And if we take some learnings from other markets around the world, we could arrive at a particular viewpoint more quickly than some of our other jurisdictions, like the UK or like Australia as well. But being clear that we must make sure the regulatory framework is in place to create and help innovation thrive.
Yeah,
Jody, your view?
Yeah, lots of notes I've been taking just to make sure I cover the points. So there's definitely a few bits that I'd like to comment on. But yeah, firstly, just thank you, Judy, and on RFI Group for hosting this today. And it's a pleasure to be here and back in a room with James and yourself, if you can call it a room, our virtual room. So yeah, just a bit of background. I'm looking after open banking for ANZ. As part of that role, I sort of participate across the industry in the industry working groups as we develop standardisation through the API Centre, and also sit on the Digital Identity New Zealand Council. And I'm very interested in digital ID, which we might fold into this conversation a little bit as we go. So yeah, I think that the models you talked about there were really good to open up some conversations. And I think, James talked about us being a little bit behind the 8 ball, and I think that's, I think that's broadly true. Equally, there are some advantages in sort of being behind a little bit, in that we can reflect on what's happened overseas, and we can look at the learnings and how they've approached it, what's worked, what hasn't. And I think it's fair to say that we probably don't have an ideal model to copy at the moment. And I think in combination with that, we've got a few different inputs for New Zealand. One of those being, smaller, what's a right-sized approach for us, and how do we do that in that journey in a really inclusive, open way that does actually result in innovation and changes. I mean, ultimately, this is all about the consumer. So it's successful when consumers see a difference. So for me, I think actually, we might not go up and ask a consumer if they know about open banking, because that really is just a framework for it to happen. But, could we go up in a couple of years and ask customers, have they benefited from these types of initiatives? Have they used these types of services? And that's got to be the proof point. So yeah, I think really great opportunity, very supportive of a lot of the comments that James mentioned, but it is complicated. And it sort of sounds like, if you've heard me on these forums, I think people just think I'm Mr. Complicated Man, because I'm always talking about the complexity. But equally, I guess my philosophy is always, believe in the potential and the opportunity, which I totally do. But we've got to test them for some realities, and there are some realities that we've just got to work through together. And that will take a little bit of time, but I think by doing that is where we really are going to make a difference, and consumers really will understand, what this new thing is. And whether it's open data, open finance, open banking, or just some great new propositions that land, on customers, that they can make better decisions, that they're feeling more empowered, that they're more inclusive, that their day-to-day life has been made easier in some way. And that's the exciting bit for me, because what open banking, open data does is it starts to create opportunities to create things for customers that they wouldn't have otherwise. And that's quite exciting, because that's innovation, something that wasn't there, something that's changed, something that we can improve. And to be able to lay a foundation and an ecosystem that could do that is quite exciting. But yeah, it will be complicated. There is a lot to work through, but I think we're on the right journey. Where that's going to lead, I think, we've got our own destiny in our hands to some degree. And we've got a window of opportunity now, I think, as a country to really, I guess, demonstrate what that can look like. And if we can do that, then I think our pathway to consumer data right or open banking will potentially look quite different, but potentially more valuable, and consumers will really understand what it is. So I think I've covered most of the point. I might just quickly touch on digital ID, because it's not mentioned there, but That for me is something that I always push quite hard, because part of the complexity is actually that we're starting to introduce multiple different parties into exchanging data, and it's hard. That's kind of data moving around, and so part of the risks are we don't actually know with certainty who it's going to. So there's a lot of mitigations that have to be put around that. So just from a risk perspective, digital identity is a good thing. But equally from a consumer's perspective, if you want to grow a digital economy, then actually digital ID is a foundation of that. And if we can leverage that to build out our open data economy, then I think we'll actually be in a better position than any jurisdiction that I can point to right now, in my view.
Yeah, I would absolutely totally agree with that, Jody, as well. And I think the other thing, just for some of the viewers, the banks are actually for this. I think there's been a lot of chatter over the period of time that the banks are a little bit slow to react. The simple fact is that we just have to take into consideration, as Jody mentioned, the complexity actually of doing this, and equally actually the punishment that the regulators can actually bear on these large incumbents should things actually go wrong. And the reality is we don't want to see situations when people's data is obviously being misplaced or misused inappropriately. So I think there's a lot of different factors that we have to consider when we're making changes of such a significant size. But back to Jody's point, absolutely, this will actually be great for everybody. We just have to look at, what's gone on before, take into consideration, the good and the bad, and then look at what does that actually mean then for New Zealand. And if we get this right, it really could put us in a very, very strong place. I remember back in the day when I first arrived here reading the story that, New Zealand was actually the first country in the world to create the first refrigerated ship out of Dunedin by a Scots person, which was awesome. But the reality is, geographically challenged as we were back then, we had to come up with some new ideas. The reality is, because of digital adoption, and one may argue that COVID helped us accelerate there, the reality is our geographical location in some instances is actually no longer a challenge. We can deploy products and solutions anywhere in the world quite easily. But the reality is we just make sure that we get this right over the next couple of years, and I think it puts us in a really strong position.
Yeah, definitely. And that creates more inclusion, and it really probably hits home to a mission statement for what open finance should be, right? And making sure it has the right motivation behind it. And digital ID is the beginning of so many parts of the digital economy, not just banking. I think 2 weeks ago in Australia, FPOS announced that it was doing digital ID so you could buy alcohol online and verify that you were of suitable age to do so. One of those creature comforts when you're in lockdown or something like that, but certainly probably necessary. But moving on in terms of the fintech space in New Zealand, when you look at the motivations, looking at competition and innovation, making sure that innovation is thriving, what sort of innovations are thriving in New Zealand when it comes to the fintech sector? Are you finding there are new plays in digital ID, or are they looking at certain parts of the experience cycle? What are some of the key things you're seeing, James?
Well, I mean, first of all, the overall sector is going gangbusters. I did a release actually just at the tail end of last week. And you've got to consider that, only a very short period of time ago, fintech was a new buzzy word. And we've come up with loads of other ones since then. But the reality is it's no longer a buzz, it's an actual thing. The sector, the global sector itself is now huge. It really is just incredible, actually, the growth that it's actually experienced in the last few years. And if you look at some of the raw data, so Greg Shanahan and his team at TIN, they produced the Investor's Guide only, I think, a couple of weeks ago. And if you look in there, fintech is still the fastest growing sector or subsector across the tech stack, which is just great to see. And I think that long may that continue, because the simple fact is, regardless of what you do, you will either pay or receive money in some function, regardless of whether you are a private, public listed organization, whether you're a government agency, there's money moving around all the time. So I think to your question, what are we seeing interesting? Obviously, we've had some great organizations for a number of years now, like Sharesies and Hatch and others who've gone into that particular part of the wealth space within financial services and opened up, I suppose, the ability for others to actually participate with a little bit of low risk, which is also quite nice. Because part of this is around education. But we're also seeing the payments, and Jody probably is better placed than I with the work that he does, obviously, in the payments API. We are seeing great organizations being born out of returning Kiwis. So I'm thinking of Shane and his partner who've just come back from Singapore and stood up Dosh. You've got other companies doing some really, really great work. And the fact is, back to Jody's point earlier on, this is going to be good for everybody in New Zealand. You know, we are going to be able to provide different options. And it will obviously mean that, you know, other people and other organizations will have to keep pace. And that's why we're also seeing more collaborative projects coming out. It's a bit of a hard one, because a lot of people, I think, they look at large organizations and it's like, why are they not partnering with fintechs or insurtechs or wealthtechs? But again, back to the point we talked earlier just a moment ago, it's hard and it's complicated, and there's a lot of things you have to go through. What I think we're seeing now, early this year, for the rest of this year, and I definitely think next year as well, is an advancement of more of those partnerships across big organizations. And that, again, is the same reason why we talk about open finance, to drive better customer outcomes. So it's great to see. Thriving sector, could do more, a little bit more clarity, dare I say it, from government. And I've had this conversation with ministers, and I've had this conversation at dinner with the PM, what they've been able to achieve in other sectors, because they've been very clear, that's what we want. We want a big stake in the ground, you know, somewhere down the line for fintech from the PM's perspective, because I certainly know that, dare I say it, the opposition are really keen to get behind this particular sector. But I'm sure Jody's got some views on what you're seeing in terms of partnerships and other parts of the fintech sector actually spinning up.
Yeah, it might be a good time to jump in. Yeah, I mean, the payment side, certainly, James, I think you're probably better placed to talk to that, but I'll touch from my experience of what I've seen. Yeah, there's certainly a lot of interest around payments, but equally the data and what can we do with it. And I think, you know, there is a huge amount of opportunity when you start thinking about and even exploring very, you know, on the surface, what sort of opportunities are out there. They're pretty immense. And so the real challenge for me is, how do you actually execute on some of these, which is, I think, is probably where there's, you know, we're seeing friction. I think that's what the next couple of years gives us the opportunity. How can we reduce some of that friction? How can we work better together? And that isn't going to be necessarily easy. It will be hard. It will require the collaboration across parties. I think what we're seeing is you know, James touched on it, but I think we're seeing a sort of coming together a little bit of the sort of, actually, no, we don't want to work with fintechs from the large incumbents. You know, actually they're here to disrupt us. You know, we can do everything on our own. Through to the fintechs that actually, no, we want to do it all on our own, and we're happily work in a garage. And, you know, I think actually, so where are the great ideas going to come from? What are they going to look like? And for me, those in the short term, those ideas are going to come through collaboration, because they're just going to unlock, and they're going to enable people to work together to create propositions that are mutually beneficial for all parties. That will change over time. That will change, and we'll see a shift in some of those dynamics. But I think that's where the opportunity is. I see, and I think this is not just my view, but I think you just look at sort of, I guess, the commentary and where investments being made and what partnerships are happening. And we won't go into detail. You can just search and see that there's a lot of them happening. You know, actually, what are the types of things that they're looking at? How are they going to add value? How are they working together to create these new things? And so that's the exciting bit. And when that comes together, you can work through some of those challenges. So for me, one of the big challenges is, and I think I agree, James, this clarity piece around outcomes, you know, you talked about at the beginning, is around switching, competition, innovation, productivity. They're all great, but they're really big. So like, what are the things we really want to go after? Like, what are the things we really want to see change? Because for those that have sort of been involved in, you know, building products or bringing new propositions to market, is, incremental, show value, earn your worth, build trust, scale, right? And so, kind of to the opposite to that, you've got this sort of view, we'll build everything and that will come. And building everything for every scenario, every use case, for every type of different partnership model and everything is going to take time. So I really do think that if we can be clear on really what are those outcomes, what are the true outcomes that we're all going to look at and say they're the ones we want to shift the dial on, and actually rally around those as NZ Inc., then I think you're going to see some real momentum. And digital ID would be one of them. How can we, if that's an outcome, how can we help people verify their identity better? How can we help people get better financial advice in this context? Or, there's so many different use cases, but the challenge is trying to do everything to all people at the same time, given that, what you can just look at overseas and the amount of investment and time and energy that's been spent trying to create these ecosystems. And, they're slowly getting there, but it wasn't a sort of big bang, everyone's on and suddenly all these things materialize. It does take time. So, James, I just to second that point, because I think the clarity there is really important. What are we really going to get after? And how can the organisation, how can NZ organise itself around that to create these opportunities for New Zealand fintech? I want to hone in on that point because I really do feel right now it's a great opportunity for Kiwi innovation, because we're here, we want to work together to create these new propositions. We can do that in a way where we're evolving standards. They're not yet in a fully open environment like you see in regulatory environments. So that means actually we can work together ahead of that to get access to fintechs, to people to working together to create value. Looking ahead, if you think about if we just opened everything up right now, what may happen? That isn't going to encourage that collaboration. You potentially might see a whole bunch of overseas competitors coming in, and they may not bring the same values and principles into what we want as an outcome. So I think if you can align some of those things together, I think some real magic will happen. But we're slowly running out of time. So I think there's an urgency aspect to that as well.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I use a couple of sort of scenarios in my thinking that because of COVID, and you could argue we were forced to accept a sort of new digital way of doing things. I mean, I remember actually interviewing Steve Yukovic, the CEO for KiwiBank, about 2 or 3 weeks prior to lockdown level 1. And one of the questions that he was asked actually from the audience is like, why have you made the announcement that you're no longer going to accept checks? And he was very honest. I mean, he basically said, look, we are a small organization when you compare us to sort of the big four, and it costs us millions and millions of dollars for less than 1% of our customers. I mean, who would have known that only a few weeks thereafter, actually, we were all in a situation, we weren't obviously using checks, and we certainly weren't using really cash either. So I think the world has changed. And I think back to that point Jody made around regulation. If you had gone back, 4 years ago and spoke to some of our regulatory bodies and talked about fintech, they'd be very much left with, really sorry, you've started to speak a foreign language. I mean, I sometimes get that anyway because obviously my Scottish accent, but that's another story. But the reality is now you've actually got COFA, which is the Council of Financial Regulators, and the FMA is the sort of the lead voice on everything fintech. So we're seeing, it's a little bit like the chessboard. All the pieces are on the board. Some are still figuring out, what their strategy is, and that's totally fine because we don't have all the answers. As Jody mentioned, even other jurisdictions around the world certainly don't. But the reality is we've got that nice momentum. We're on the diving board. We've got a little bit of momentum. We haven't quite decided what jump or what dive we're going to do, but the reality is it's there for the taking. And I think that we are seeing more of these collaborative projects, which is great, and we will see more of it. The question is making sure that I suppose we are building things that do actually solve problems, and we're not just creating something new and shiny over there that doesn't really solve a problem, because that can be a little bit distracting as well. So I think focused attention, clarity of thought, and I think we could really do some really cool stuff, which we've already seen happen anyway.
Excellent. And with that sort of clarity of thought, it's important to obviously understand what are the sort of main pain points customers have throughout their experiences with financial services. Do you feel that it is about solving those experiences that need to be digitized or have the data enabled to make it cleaner? Or do you think that that's first and then maybe creating solutions where the customer can get a benefit from their data just from a knowledge perspective? Which one do you think tips the scale? Certainly, probably for banks, it's about making sure the experience is good and secure. But then at what point do you think the market will start to expect, hey, I need some more value back other than just it being slick and digital?
Great question. Yeah, I mean, look, Jody, I'll jump in just for a couple of comments. Obviously,
yeah, go, James.
You'll have some great things to add. Look, I'm going to pick on the insurance sector just for a moment, because the reality is, if you look at the sort of the cycle of big organizations, banks tend to move first, and then insurance tends to move a little bit slower. If you think about, Julien, I don't know if you've made an insurance claim in the last year or 2 years or 3 or 4 years.
No.
and I hope that continues. But I'm sitting here at home today, and I've made a couple in the last couple of years, and it's not been a great experience. And that's from someone that works within, the financial services sector. So I think it's to the point. There's a problem there for consumers, that the value of insurance is questioned. We are the second most expensive country in the world for insurance. Also, when you tend to call on it when things go wrong, that's not always ideal. But we are seeing a shift. So if you look at companies like AIA in their Vitality program, back to Jody's point, we're trying to use data in order to deliver better customer outcomes, whether it's a reduction in premiums, people actually living a more healthy lifestyle. So if you are in the gym and you're making decisions, all of that data is available. So if you can then sort of collate that and bring that back into the system, then you can actually drive better outcomes. But there's also the trust element. So as an example, if I want to open up my data to, let's say, a health insurer or life insurer, then obviously I've got to be trusting them that actually they're making the right decisions for me. So I'd look at it and think about prevention. So actually, yeah, you can have all of my data if it helps prevent me get ill. And therefore, if it helps prevent me get ill, you actually will not be called upon as much as you might actually if we do it completely the opposite way. So there's going to be this little shift in power and dynamics about how that relationship will actually evolve. But the reality is we're actually seeing it now. And we're seeing, our InsurTech ecosystem here in New Zealand is really, really thriving. Not as big as maybe Australia as an example, but different size of market, which is, obviously taken into consideration. But the reality is we are seeing some pain points in different parts of the financial services sector that new organizations and we shouldn't just say the techs, we should actually say in collaboration with big organizations are actually driving great customer outcomes. So I think we understand our data better, we access our data better, we can interpret our data better, and then because of all of those learnings, we can have actually a far better conversation with our customers, and that's what we've got to continue towards. And I think we'll definitely see more of that. But Jody's probably got some great examples in there as well.
Yeah, I think the point you talked around there on customer value is really important, right? And you've got to keep bringing this back to the customer, because that's what it's about. And these aren't different customers, right? ANZ customers aren't different to somebody else's customers. They're the same people. It's us, right? It's the same person. So, when we come back to thinking about what pain points, I think we can all relate to those pain points. You've got insurance, James. I've had a few others myself, not insurance related, but, ID verification, actually being able to prove my income and my expenses for loans. I really struggle with inefficiency personally. It's like printing off forms or printing out things and sending it off, and then people lose it. All those sorts of things. So have we got a perfect system today? Far from it. Is there opportunities to innovate? Yes. If it's a big enough customer pain point, then everyone's going to get behind it, because they're the ones that I think are going to get the traction first, to my point earlier on. So because they're the pain points that all consumers are facing, and they need to be solved. And so there's certainly a lot of those in the banking sector. We are working on a number of those. Other banks will be doing the same. And there are opportunities there for people to come and help with that, for bringing different capabilities and ideas to the table. And so, this sort of leads on, and maybe it's a topic I think we're going to get to, which is, how do you collaborate? How do we solve shared problems? And there's a number that we've looked at lately where we could say, actually, here's a really great proposition, because here's the benefit for one party, here's the benefit for the other, and here's the benefit for the customer. So that's something that we can get behind, and it's got a great story, and it really warrants investment of time. And I think going back to focus and clarity, with right size, and we've got limited resources. We don't have 150 people sitting on working on OBI, or 75 people sitting on OBIE, which is the entity that looks after open banking in the UK. We've got, I won't say what we've got, but a lot less than that working on it at the moment. So, this right size, find those opportunities. What are the high value, and how can we leverage those? And so, I think it's, as I said before, a great, exciting opportunity. Customers will dictate what propositions are successful and what comes first. And only if we put the customer first and we listen to the customer's viewpoint in the outcomes that we target. If you don't, then customers won't get value, because we wouldn't have got our measurements and our sort of direction correct. And we could end up with something that, we could be on the diving board and do a belly flop, right? Or we can get a perfect 10. So, that's the opportunity we've got right now. So.
And I think, Julien, what we're seeing obviously is education playing a really sort of big role in how people interact with organizations as well. I mean, I use a really easy example. So we've all, I'm sure, got our favorite TV programs, but back in the day, if your TV program was on a Monday evening, let's say at 7 o'clock, you'd watch that episode and you'd be sort of left with a little bit of a cliffhanger, and you'd have to wait till next Monday at 7 o'clock to obviously catch back up. Whereas now you've got other, obviously, vehicles where you can just watch whenever you want. And obviously that's been really, really good. Banking and financial services is really no different. When people actually want to do something, they want to do it when they want to do it. We no longer have to put sort of the big top hat and tails on to go down and sort of meet the bank manager, because the reality is you take out your phone, by the swipe of a thumb, and you're already in your banking app, and away you go. But I think also, to Jody's point, what are the pain points that we can address, or should be able to address, relatively well? And Jody, I think what you were alluding to almost sounds very similar to myself. My wife and I went for a little bit of a top-up mortgage. We wanted to do some renovation on the house. And bearing in mind, I only bank with one bank, so I'm quite maybe unusual even in the tech circles. All of my information is in there. I've been verified numerous times. I've got loans, I've got my mortgage, I've got, you name it, it's in there. But I still had to go through the process. I still had to give my date of birth. I still has to be verified, check my income, check my outgoings, paper format, all this stuff. And it's like, this is just incredulous. It really is. All of the information that you need in order to actually, satisfy my request is there. In fact, I shouldn't even need to actually speak to you. I should just be able to do it in my app. So I think we've moved forward. We are getting better, but I think that on demand, but equally big organizations have a little bit of what I call the duty of care. They've got to help educate their customers, especially when they are evolving a product or a solution, and the reasons why it will be beneficial, because people move at different pace, and that's totally fine. But the reality is, it can't just be generally a product for just a small segment of the market. It has to be much wider than that as well.
That almost touches on, I think, a couple of years ago when open banking, open data was being first spoken about. One of the first counterpoints was banks have enough data, they don't do enough with it already. But I think we're getting to the point with innovation and fintech partnerships where banks can do a lot more with the data and create those correct solutions. Just going back, Jody, to collaboration, and I think we can also merge this into, I guess, another interesting point is, have you seen some great collaborations in markets globally that you would love to replicate in your market? What do you think would be the ideal, the utopia?
Yeah, good question, because there's quite a lot going on. And I think it does come back to individual strategy as part of it, but ultimately, it still comes back is what's good for customers. I mean, and how is it going to help them improve their financial well-being and overall well-being? So what are the things that can be done, in that space? So that's a big driver, not only for ANZ, speaking on behalf of my employer for a minute, but equally New Zealand. It's a big thing that we want to focus on. How do we improve the well-being of our people? And financial well-being is a big driver of that. It's a big driver of your overall health. So what can we do? So I think there's some great opportunities there. Some of that sort of extends through to advice. How do you help budget? How do you help? I've seen examples of some facilitating how do people get access to grants and support for that. So those sorts of use cases around financial well-being, I think, are really, really useful. And anything that can start to make consumers' lives easier in that respect. So, I won't point to any particular ones. There's quite a few, but I think, look, for me, it goes back to those principles of what I mentioned before. For me, open banking, open data is about how do we create things that weren't there. So if you can see an opportunity to create something that's better, that's made someone's life easier, that has been made available because partners are working together in a way that they're open and collaborative, in a way that they couldn't do it before. And I think the really important part about open services is that this isn't like, hey, one bank develops it with one partner and that's kind of the end of it. This is actually, the real value is going to be when those services become, open services available to all. And so, we had a recent one we've been working on with Spark called View Bills, which allows big billers to send payment requests into customers. This is great. It sort of helps solve the problem between the dilemma for billers that they want to be paid on time and have a surety of payment, and customers want more visibility and control. Historically, they've been two conflicting things. Yeah. So actually, can we create propositions which solves both of those people's needs, and can you do it in a collaborative way that helps people make payments and have more control over their bills and deliver some value out to customers and all parties? And you go, that's really exciting. So where are more of those? Because that's the stuff that actually millions of customers can use. And so, there's a few there I mentioned, Julien, but there are many more, and you only have to do a quick Google search to see some of the exciting sort of propositions that are being developed by parties working together.
Yeah. And I think those kinds of examples are also things that consumers will adopt quickly because there's an instant benefit and there's minimal risk. The last thing consumers will jump into is something where, social media aside, is somewhere where their data is going to be used to sell them something else or go down that path. But it's giving some benefit, some convenience.
And consent,
James,
we talked about before, the consent piece, right? And customer education. This is really, really, really important, because if you can't articulate that in a way that customers understand and they feel informed and they make great decisions, then it undermines the trust of everything. And so that's again where you can work together to really understand how do you create that confidence for the customer, that they know what they're doing, and it's not a single customer of one, is a shared customer. So how do you do that? And that is really important as well.
Yeah, I think you've touched on an absolute fantastic area around the sort of the financial health and well-being. We know it is an area where actually it can create some stress. People thinking about their financial situation. You look at some of the research that was done even before COVID, but certainly during COVID as well. It can be the number one thing that people really do fret upon. So I think, to Jody's point, that sort of that education piece, and how do we with these new products and solutions, how do we present them in such a way that people really just get it and they understand why it would actually be good for them? And I think, to Jody's point as well, it's not just an ANZ customer, customer across the broad spectrum, but also actually we're talking about regulation having a role here, about the suitability and I suppose the sustainability of products now. So if you look at insurance, you could take out insurance, let's say in your early 20s, but who's asking the question 25 years down the line, is that product actually still the right product for you? You're now married, you've got a couple of kids, you've got a bigger house, you've got 2 cars. So I think that's part of what's the role of the regulator, but also actually the role of big organizations but equally having the ability then to actually share that information and use the data is making it easier for everybody else. And Kiwis, dare I say it, historically they've used property as the sort of like the retirement piece, whereas now actually only really in a few years we've seen other products and solutions now come to market that are now giving people different choices to make. And I think that's fantastic to see, and obviously long may that continue. But the reality is it's got to be in such a way that it appeals to the sort of the mass. It can't just be isolated at one particular part of the segment. And I think that's where we've done that pretty well actually in New Zealand so far to date.
Excellent. Well, the fire is dying down. I think we've covered a lot of ground today, but look, really appreciate your time, Jody and James. I think it'll be interesting to see how this all plays out over the next 6 to 12 months, and certainly what sort of model New Zealand adopts. But I think we all look forward to seeing some great innovations and collaborations that help customers at the end of the day, and obviously keeps everyone secure in what they're doing with the data. But look, thank you again for joining us, and we'll hope to see you next time.
Cool. Thanks, Julien. Jody, nice to see you again.
Yeah, thanks, James. Cheers. Bye.